I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. U.S. President Joe Biden says Russia's attack on Ukraine and Ukrainians amounts to genocide. Mr. Biden accuses President Vladimir Putin of trying to wipe out the idea of even being a Ukrainian. Declaring any targeted campaign aimed at wiping out a group as genocide is not just a strong word. It could carry obligations to act. That's partly because of a genocide treaty approved by the UN General Assembly in the years immediately after World War II, which was signed by the United States and more than 150 other nations. Well, joining us now to give us deeper insight into whether the Russian invasion can be legally designated as a genocide is Ms. Leila Sadat, a special advisor to the International Criminal Court prosecutor and director of the Crimes Against Humanity Initiative. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with this, ma'am. What constitutes as a genocide under the genocide treaty approved by the UN General Assembly?
So genocide means a crime committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial, national, ethnic, or religious group. It's a very serious crime.
So what is the significance of Joe Biden himself calling this a genocide? What is likely to come from this move?
You know, one of the things that's so interesting is we've seen in the past sort of a failure of states to label crimes as they're happening. They don't want to use the word genocide. They don't want to call something a crime against humanity. So I think it's very positive that President Biden has decided to actually use the word genocide. Whether it can be proven in a court of law is another issue, but it is a very, very serious step that the United States and Canada have taken, which requires them to commit themselves to some kind of action, not necessarily a military action, but some kind of action whereby they agree to help prevent and potentially to punish these acts of genocide if they can be proven.
All right, ma'am. So I guess the big question here would be whether the actions committed by Russian forces in Ukraine can realistically be designated as a genocide.
That, of course, is always the issue. We have seen it very, very difficult to prove in a court of law that something even as awful as what we're seeing on our television screens now with respect to Ukraine is actually a genocide. Because what you need is that sort of smoking gun, that actual statement and that connection between the leader and the crimes on the ground, that the crimes were committed with this specific criminal intent to destroy the group. And sometimes even when we have evidence of intent, we don't have a significant enough crime. Sometimes we have significant crimes, but we don't have specific evidence of the intent. So as a criminal lawyer, normally I would say these are easier to charge as a crime against humanity. And in fact, most of the reports we're getting from the OSCE and from other observer missions are focusing more on war crimes and crimes against humanity. But that said, the fact that the president and the prime minister use the idea of genocide is important.
Important indeed. All right, ma'am. Well, what further steps do world leaders need to take in order to move forward this potential designation of genocide?
Well, what they really need to do is support the investigations of the International Criminal Court and Ukraine's federal prosecutor. Many states have dispatched teams of investigators to the ground, and we need to now collect the evidence, establish the evidence, and stand very much unified when there's pushback against the allegations of criminality, which there already have been from the Russian Federation, which has stated that it has not committed crimes. The evidence thus far that we have shows a widespread pattern of criminality, and the ICC prosecutor himself, when requesting the issuance of arrest warrants in the Georgia situation, actually pointed out the similarity in the pattern in the Georgia conflict in 2008 and the current pattern we're seeing on the ground: attacks on the Mariupol maternity hospital, attacks on the theater, shelling of apartment buildings, allegations of torture and rape, deportation, disappearances. These are very, very significant crimes, and they look very similar to what we've seen in the past. So right now we're trying to document the offenses, collect the evidence, and of course support the Ukrainian people as they address this crisis.
We'll definitely have to keep our eyes on this developing situation. Professor Sadat, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, when we return, we'll be taking a look at some reasons why COVID-19 tends to affect people differently. Our weekly interview with Dr. Abhishek Raut from Apr Medical Group coming up next. Stay tuned. Now in our third year of the pandemic, Canadians are dealing with an even more infectious COVID-19 variant, the BA.2 subvariant of Omicron. Health officials are saying a recent resurgence of COVID-19 patients in hospitals across Canada will likely continue for another month. Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and the Prairies have all reported an increase in hospitalizations from the virus. However, infections in the general population can differ from person to person. Some may experience severe symptoms, while others compare their cases to the common cold. And some may not have symptoms at all. So what do we know so far about how COVID interacts with the body and why symptoms differ between people? Well, joining us now to give us some clarity on this in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apr Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Great to be here.
Now, as we mentioned, some infections can cause severe symptoms, while others might not feel any symptoms at all with COVID. So why do COVID infections differ so much between people?
That's a great question. I mean, we're talking about 2 years of COVID-19 now, millions of cases, and still we have the question of why do some people get infected, others don't necessarily get infected or have very minimal symptoms. Now, there's a lot of factors at play here which determine how a person gets sick and whether they get sick, what symptoms they have, and what they can transmit. Researchers don't really know all the answers yet, but I think there is a number of reasons here that why some people are intrinsically resistant to COVID-19. I think there's likely some genetic factors at play here that cause this intrinsic immunity. Now, this concept isn't new to COVID-19. It's believed that a small percentage of people have always been immune to things such as the plague even hundreds of years ago, and some people are actually immune to HIV even if exposed. But what we're talking about is a very small percentage of the population here, and many others, in fact, are infected and do experience very slight symptoms and are basically asymptomatic.
So what do we know about this small percentage of the population that may not experience these severe symptoms compared to others who may experience more of a severe case?
That's right. So first, a person has to be infected, meaning they are exposed to the virus and it's gotten into that cells. After that, a person could be asymptomatic, have mild symptoms, or even develop more severe or life-threatening disease. What we do know is that when a virus comes into our body, especially COVID-19, it attaches to a range of proteins on our cells. These protein connections then really start the pathway towards making us, unfortunately, sick. But the theory is that many different people have different protein variants, and some of them make them less appealing to viruses. So we have these differences in our genes. Some differences, they're not a big deal, at least we don't think they're a big deal under most common scenarios. And then there are some genes that can be quite dangerous as well. These genetic variances could likely explain a part of the puzzle on the differences in reaction with COVID-19. There's, of course, a lot of other factors that play a role as well.
And in terms of these other factors, we hear a lot about how stress can affect the body. So are there any environmental factors such as stress or maybe a lack of healthy eating that might impact how the virus affects the body?
Absolutely. I would answer that with all of the above. I think the most important feature beyond the virus itself is the person's immunity or immune status. We know that elderly people have a less robust immune system compared to young adults and children. And even though a child's immune system is not as educated compared to adults, the immune response it leans more toward what is referred to as that innate immunity, because it's already primed and activated in certain facets and can adjust rapidly. Other than that, what we do know is because children have smaller airways, this could also explain why some are being hospitalized for COVID-19, since Omicron tends to favor the upper respiratory tract rather than the lungs.
All right, Dr. Raut, well, other than regular masking, sanitizing, and social distancing, what other steps can people take to improve their overall health in order to fight off this virus?
Well, so age and pre-existing medical conditions are likely the highest risk factors when it comes to developing severe disease from COVID-19. Older adults, especially those over 60, make up a greater share of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths than younger groups. The Public Health Agency of Canada has reported that more than half of all reported cases of COVID-19 have involved those under 60, but individuals older than that make up nearly 2/3 of all hospitalizations. So a number of chronic medical conditions, such as lung and heart disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney and liver disease, all can worsen outcomes. So the ideal thing to do here is work on optimizing those medical conditions when we can, making sure the blood pressure is down, making sure the sugars are in control, which can then prevent and fight off this virus.
All right, Dr. Ratt, always an informative interview. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
After the break, an interview about cannabis investments with Brendan Caldwell. Cannabis stocks dipped yesterday. However, investors remain optimistic on the heels of 420. The marijuana industry is expected to grow to double its value by 2025. Canada became the second country in the world to legalize cannabis on October 17th, 2018. Recreational cannabis is also legal in 18 states in the U.S. So what does this growing market mean for investors? Well, joining us now to give us more insight into cannabis stocks is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon, Nima. Thanks for having me.
Now, Brendan, yesterday was 420, so that's a day that's been connected to cannabis culture for decades. But what does this day mean for investors?
Well, I think the original meeting came out of some school, probably in California, where the kids all got together after school at 420 to smoke up. So the date became synonymous with the time, and there we are. Obviously, cannabis has been a big deal in Canada from both a legalization point of view. As you pointed out, we're one of the leading countries in the world for making what millions of people were doing legal anyway. And also from an investor point of view, we are, I believe, the leading country in the world for public cannabis companies. There was a huge interest in these, as there often is when the market first comes to existence. But cannabis obeys the law of economics like anything else, in that eventually there's not going to be hundreds and hundreds of cannabis companies. There will be a consolidation, both because some companies succeed, some go out of business, and also with consolidation. So it might be that this, if I hesitate to use the term second wave, but after the initial flush of enthusiasm and then the falling off from the high, you've seen a bit of a resurgence here, second wind, if you will. And cannabis is getting a little bit more of a puff.
All right, Brendan. Well, I do know that you're on the board of the Canadian Securities Exchange. Now, that was at the forefront dealing with Canadian cannabis companies. So tell us a little bit more about your personal experience dealing with the cannabis industry.
Well, one of my kids joked with me when we were discussing this just yesterday that she wasn't even sure that if I knew what color cannabis was. So my personal experience is somewhat limited. With the Canadian Securities Exchange, actually very interesting. It is quite a bit like the technology sector was for NASDAQ 40 years ago. The NYSE turned up its nose, the New York Stock Exchange, that is, turned up its nose at technology stocks because they didn't have plant and equipment. They just had people and this thing called software. So they wouldn't list, and NASDAQ came into existence because of the software industry. So the Canadian Securities Exchange has been around for 18 years. It just needed an industry that it could do that nobody else could. And the Toronto Stock Exchange wouldn't list cannabis companies with exposure in the US, because you pointed out, while 18 states have legalized cannabis, it's still federally illegal in the US. So for various reasons, TSX wouldn't list those companies. So all the scores of cannabis companies, hundreds indeed of cannabis companies that wanted to become public, they needed a venue, and that was the Canadian Securities Exchange. And we've been a full part of the up and down, but when this exchange got started 18 years ago, or we came into it about 10 years ago, yes, we just needed industry. Didn't dream in 1,000 years that it would be pot.
All right, Brendan. So I guess the big question here would be, is cannabis a good investment for our investors in Canada?
Well, I think what you've seen when you've had the first flush and then now this sorting out the industry, one needs to look at this like any other industry. There's nothing special from an economic perspective about cannabis. It's company by company within the sector, and those that are able to generate sales, grow their business, have earnings, and because it's a regulated business, it's we've seen not run afoul of the regulatory authorities, because Canada is cutting edge. We can't afford to be offside. So those companies that can do that may end up being, in fact, good investments. My own preference is I can see the medical uses for cannabis. Never been a big fan of the recreational uses, but this and the next wave will actually be psychedelics, where the ability of those to treat symptoms of PTSD and other mental illness issues can be tremendous. So the medical uses, I think, still have tremendous potential from both areas, both sectors.
All right, always an interesting and informative conversation, Brendan. Thank you again for joining us today. Up next, our interview with Timur, a Ukrainian resident currently located in Kharkiv. A regional governor in eastern Ukraine says 5 civilians have been killed by Russian shelling. The Kharkiv region governor said Tuesday that another 17 residents were wounded in the Russian rocket barrage in the center of Kharkiv and its outskirts. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, has faced Russian attacks since the start of the Russian invasion on February 24th. Well, joining us now to give us an on-the-ground perspective of what's happening in Kharkiv is Timur, a Kharkiv native who is helping to bring food, water, and diapers to those who are unable to evacuate in the Saltovka area. He is joined by team member Bronislava Shmilovich from Washington, who joins us through audio to translate. Timur, Bronislava, thank you again for joining us today. We've got a lot to unpack, so I'm going to jump right in. Now, Timur, you are calling us from a war zone. There have been Russian shelling attacks in Kharkiv since February 24th. Tell us about the obstacles that you and your team are facing while trying to bring these necessities to people in Saltovka.
Yeah, that's us.
Да, в данный момент у нас очень все тяжело на Салтовке. Еда доходит с огромнейшими проблемами, на самом деле. Ни одна организация нам не помогает. Мы сами действуем так, что нам на PayPal скидывают деньги люди, хорошие люди, и мы закуповываем все и разносим людям под выстрелами, под бомбежками со стороны России. Мы это делаем. Многие из наших ребят уже попадали в очень тяжелый момент.
The situation is very hard in Kharkiv. We are being bombed and shelled constantly by the Russian forces. Our team is trying to get aid to the residents of Kharkiv. We have not been able to obtain aid from any of the larger organizations that are on the ground. So the situation is very difficult in our area.
Sounds like you've got a very brave team over there, Timur. So what is needed most for the people in the Kharkiv region right now?
Еда. Нам нужна еда, больше всего еда. Памперсы для детей и еда, которую можно принести в подвалы людям.
They need food, and again, food, pampers, and baby items. The food that can be sustained in the basements, because that's where the most of the residents are.
And from previous conversations, we know some of your team members have been injured. You're literally risking your lives in Kharkiv. So how is your team managing while working in this dangerous environment? What's keeping you guys going?
Наш несломленный дух. Мы украинцы, и мы готовы сражаться до конца. Нас не поставить на колени. Мы страна, которая не станет никогда рабами, и у нас есть демократия в нашей стране. Мы не Россия, мы не под диктатурой. Мы страна, у которой есть демократия, мы готовы умирать за это. Мы готовы умирать за нашу свободу.
Our unwavering spirit is what gets us through. We're not slaves to any forces. We're Ukrainians, and we have democracy. So what will get us through these hard times is our hearts, because we stand with Ukraine.
All right, Timur, how can our Canadian viewers help your team's efforts in Kharkiv?
Могут нам помогать, скидывать какие-то пожертвования на PayPal, потому что это единственный способ так далеко нам помогать. Это единственный способ. Больше не знаю, каких способов. Или отправлять еду.
At this moment, the only way that anyone can help from a distance is to be able to contribute to our PayPal, because this is the only way we've been successful in purchasing food for our neighbors. Or you can try to send food, however, it's not reaching us, as you have seen. So PayPal from abroad really makes an impact on the people of Kharkiv.
And for our viewers, we will be displaying Timur's PayPal for you to donate if you are interested. All right, for some more perspective, Timur, we know Kharkiv has been facing Russian shelling since February 24th. What is left of your home?
Что
Это
осталось
было
от
очень...
твоего дома?
Моего дома нету. И домов моих друзей нету. Мы на Северной Салтовке. Это самый опасный район сейчас в Харькове. Нас разбомбили. Домов нету, люди умирают.
I don't have a home. My friends have lost a home. We're in North Saltovka. Everything has been bombed. People are dying. There's nothing left.
That's very hard to hear, Timur. We've got about a minute left here, but do you have any last messages for our Canadian viewers today?
У тебя есть какие-то последние слова для канадских viewers?
Да. Поддержите нас, пожалуйста. Поддержите Украину. Дайте нам поддержку. Это единственное, что может быть. Только спасение. Все.
Yes, please support us. Support us as any way you can, because that's the only thing that will save us. Please support Ukraine.
Most.
Timur, thank you for your bravery, and thank you for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again, Canada.